We are here today with Father Hendree Harrison, the rector of Good Shepherd Church. Hendree, thank you for joining us to share your story. I'd like to start with, as I understand, you are fifth generation Episcopal priest in your family. That's impressive. What was that like for you?
Yeah. So thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to get to be a part of this Faith Stories ministry. Yes, I'm a fifth generation Episcopal priest. My father was a priest, so I was raised in the church by a priest. It's kind of an interesting question. What was that like? I was a fish in water. I knew nothing else but the water in which I was swimming as a kid. My dad was a pure extrovert, a fellow that just really loved people, loved being out in the world. I'm very bookish. He was not very bookish. So it was fun to be his son, to be honest. We'd go around town. Everybody knew him. He was a popular, well-loved guy. And I never, as a little boy, had a sense that I wanted to be a priest, but it was fun to be in the church. My brother and I often had kind of run to the church after hours, if you will, when we were up there. And Dad had a big church north of Atlanta, and we knew every nook and cranny of the place. As a little boy, I had to go to church. It wasn't a choice. There was like zero choice, no negotiating, nothing. So I had to go to church. So what I always wanted to do when I was at church was give me a job, because I would be bored out of my mind sitting in the pew. So I was an acolyte every chance that I got to be an acolyte. I worked in the nursery. My mother was over the nursery. We had a big nursery program at St. David's Episcopal Church in Roswell, where I grew up. And as soon as I could, maybe 12 years old, I got a job working for her in the nursery. So I'd go to church at 8 o'clock, would serve as an acolyte then work in the nursery, go to Sunday school, and then go on about our way. So it was a good life, really. The church takes up an awful lot of time from her clergy. So while I had wonderful parents and no complaints there, it would be naive and less than the full testimony if I didn't say, the church put a lot of demands on my father. So there were some things, in spite of all of his best efforts, that he wasn't able to be at. But it was a good life. People, when I was a little boy, I remember they would say, well, you'll be a priest like your father. I'm the namesake, And no, I'll never be a priest. I don't have any interest in being a priest. I was going to be an archaeologist, hunting dinosaur bones. I was going to be an FBI agent. I was going to be a Secret Service agent. I was going to be a lawyer. I was going to be a rock star. Anything but a priest.
What was your instrument
But
to
here
be a
I
rock
am,
star?
Yeah. So I fell in love with the Beatles when I was 12 years old. And I remember sitting on the floor. I can see it in my mind's eye right now. Sitting on the floor in my bedroom upstairs at 1216 Oldwoods Court in Roswell, Georgia, and learning about the Beatles. And I got all the cassette tapes in those days. When I was a kid, cassette tapes of the Beatles, and I just listened to them back to back to back, and they blew my mind. I just hadn't heard anything like it. I was fortunate. I have two older sisters, and music's always been a big part of my life. My two older sisters would commonly have a boyfriend, and that boyfriend would be into really cool music, and I would get all the music. So I was always a little bit ahead of the curve for kids my age. And so I played guitar. I played piano first, and then played guitar and a little bit of drums, and have been writing songs since I was 12 years old. And played in a band in high school and college, and still write songs to this day. But yeah.
So the love of music really kind of fits in with the Episcopal tradition in any event, right?
Yeah, I mean, we grew up, music every Sunday in church. That's not the kind of music that I played or really listened to back in those days, or even now. But to your point, I was exposed to music. I mean, week in and week out, singing with groups in the church. So church music, by its very nature, is seeking to be a vehicle to take you deeper, which is what I found in the Beatles, and what, for my age and my stage, I found that in rock and roll. I've always had a sense since I was a little boy that there was a deeper depth to go to in all things. And so music early on was one of the ways that I went to the deeper depth. Literature has also always been a big love of my life. My mother is a tremendous, voracious reader, and she instilled in me from early on, from a little boy, a love of literature and reading. That's why the story, if you listen to kind of pay attention to my ministry at all, even in a cursory way, you'll quickly realize that story is central to me. So she was giving me books like Catcher in the Rye when I was in my early teens. Yeah, a real gift, right? And Mark Twain's works, and I became enamored of Arthur Conan Doyle early on, and of course grew up on C.S. Lewis, and John Steinbeck was in my mid-teens was a favorite. I read every book he wrote, literally, before I left high school. So music and literature, yeah, early vehicles for me to sort of try to access the transcendent and go to the deeper depth that life just holds for all of us.
That's a very fascinating way to put things. In your ministry, you place a tremendous emphasis on God's love. As a child growing up in the church, and you talked about being busy, when did you begin to feel God's love, or did you? Or how did you experience that?
Yeah. That's a great question. I certainly grew up in a loving home, and I'm one of four, so I have two older sisters and a younger brother. And though I don't want to create some kind of romantic, idealistic image of the four of us, we weren't just sort of constantly telling each other we loved each other, but we were thick. So that's that unspoken bonds of love. My little brother and I spent hours upon hours upon hours playing, all day, every day, out and about. When I was a kid, this is a little bit of a rabbit trail, but when I was a kid, of course, I'll be 50 in April, so there were no cell phones when I was growing up. We were not allowed to watch TV at my house. That was just the rule of our house. So my mom was just like, outside, boys, go outside. So Todd and I, my little brother's Todd, we just ran thick outside through the woods and all over our neighborhood all day long. And I guess, again, we fought a lot and just sort of carried on like brothers do. But you're probably mirroring this to me now, Michael. I mean, we had a love. There was a love. It knit us together in an unspoken way back in those early days. In addition to that, it's a good question. How did I come to know love? My father, it's all he ever talked about was love from the pulpit and his ministry as a priest. So he had a firm conviction, which I inherited. And he got it from the tradition, from Jesus, of course, that all of us are loved no matter what. And that life's fundamental goal this is the way I put it, he wouldn't put it this way, was just to be swallowed up by love. And I learned that from him because it's all he ever talked about.
So what came about that made you choose to become a priest? Because that is a very significant decision.
Yeah. It's a good question.
Was there a particular moment or a realization, or was it a gradual process?
Yeah. So I guess I'll kind of back up a little bit to work my way into the answer to that. There's a very distinct answer. But there's an important part of my story that starts really, really early on. When I was a little boy, and I mean this very literally, I was painfully shy. Today I can function in a very extroverted way, and I love people, and I love life, and there's a joy that's sort of got an indomitable buoyancy that lives inside of me. So I'm always energized to engage with people. But I'm just functioning as an extrovert. I'm actually an introvert. I recharge by being alone. My wife's an extrovert, and she's ready to go to that next party, and I'm like, can't do it. Gotta go home, or I'm not going to make it through the next day. As a little boy, I was painfully shy. So I hadn't yet learned sort of the gifts of introversion, rather. I was just scared and shy. Couldn't look anybody in the eye. To the extent that I had an adult in my life who was a dear friend of the family, and she really tried to nurture me and encourage me out of my shyness. And she would say, what is your name? She knew my name, but I would talk to a little child. She would say, what is your name? And I would look down, and under my breath, I would say, nobody. And she was not going to be defeated by that. And in an effort to sort of stay connected to me and to jolly me up, if you will, she would say, okay, Mr. Nobody. I'll call you Mr. Nobody. So just an illustration of just how shy come out of childhood with the nickname Mr. Nobody. That introversion was a real challenge for me because it kept me from making a lot of friends early on. It was very limiting socially, and it was masking a fear that I just didn't even know where that came from. I was just kind of a scared little boy. But it also had a gift side, because the introversion and the shyness also gave me the gift of this immense inner world. So I was very much in touch with my emotions. I was very much in touch. I could read a room from a little boy, I remember. I could read the energy of other people from a little boy. I loved animals and nature and being outside. I had a few close friendships. My closest was with my little brother, and I was just real tuned into the frequency of those relationships and those people. And in the midst of that, and I only can see this looking back. I'm not saying at 7 years old I was plugged into the mystics, but looking back, I can see that in that quiet, God was opening up doorways for me into what I call the depth dimension of life. Like that vibrancy, that life force that is hidden underneath all things and is sourcing it. It's very ground of being. So I go through most of my adolescence like this. And when I was 19 years old, I was working it was a summer after my freshman year, and I was working as a staff member at the church camp in Toccoa, Georgia that I grew up going to. And we were on a break between camps, and I was driving through North Georgia, just through the country. Back in those days, we were raised in Georgia. You want to get away, put in whatever the latest punk rock record is that's just come off the shelf, get in your car, roll the windows down, and take off, baby. And so I was by myself for whatever reason. I was driving through the country in a 1980 four-door Honda Accord, 5-speed, so it was stick shift, which made it all the more fun. It was kind of an awful lime green, windows down, listening to the radio, probably going way too fast for whatever the speed limit was. And I crested a hill, and the car didn't leave the ground, but it sort of seemed like, you ever crest a hill, it's like, wow, I don't think, did we leave the ground on that? Crested the hill, sort of at that top speed, it feels like we're leaving the ground, and just for a split second of a split second of a split second, the tiniest fraction of time, time seemed to stop. And I looked left, I looked right, I looked straight forward. Again, this is according to lightning strike. And just everything was connected, as if seeing the backside of the quilt in a sort of metaphorical sense. And I had this clarion sense, couldn't have been clearer, couldn't have been deeper, couldn't have been higher and broader, that I was to be a priest. Okay. The moment passed, car came back to, again, whatever, car crested the hill, we're clearly back on the ground, motor on, and whatever weight that I was carrying at 19, not knowing what the future was to be, was left back on that hill. And there was a lightness and a clarity that just felt certain. And I remember also thinking shortly, maybe that afternoon, the next day, that night, something just real, almost sort of right after that, like I could relax a little bit more. I was only 19. I had 3 more years of college, I guess, and whatever seminary entailed. So, but the path was laid out. Okay. That was the moment. That's a very impressive story. Yeah. Now, you briefly mentioned mystics,
and that quest. In your ministry, you place a very high value on studying the mystics, and it's a prominent role, I think, in your life.
Yeah.
What is a mystic, and can you describe your passion and talk about your passion for the mystics?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, good question. So the simplest definition of a mystic is one who knows God by experience. And, as soon as you say that, then you kind of got to back off it, because that's not it.
Yeah.
A mystic is one who's experienced God in a way that is beyond senses. But all we have is our senses to sort of access description of experience. So as soon as I say experience of God beyond senses, then I got to use my senses to try to talk about it, right? I'm even using my hands right now, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's an important thing to say when we're talking about the mystics, because the mystics are folks who have an experience of God that has, as Thomas Merton says, an obscure certainty. So don't resolve the tension, right? A mystic is one who will describe an intimate experience of God, and then after the description, immediately say, strike all of that from the record, because it's far less than adequate. And once you hear someone say that, and you sort of nod, and you're like, I know what you're talking about. Now we're in the territory, right? So the mystics of our Christian tradition in particular are ones who've had these experiences and intuitions of God beyond experience and beyond what can be recognized with the senses, and then have the gift of coming back to tell us about it. And generally, they're telling us about it in words that they're using to write books or poems or songs or these sorts of things. So my interest in the mystics, I think, came really very organically out of my upbringing in the church. So I'm raised in the church by a man, my father and my mother, who are not necessarily all that interested in the mystics in particular, though they're rounded, and so they understand them and appreciate them. But it's not like I was raised on the mystics, right? So I'm raised by this pure extrovert who's not very literary or bookish, but who's into people and the concrete experiences of life. My dad was one of his great passions as a hobby was he was a barbecue guy. So he had 1,000-gallon, I think it was a 500 to 1,000-gallon smoker that a buddy of his made out of a big propane tank, and he loved to smoke hams, pork butts. I don't know all the right terminology, but smoke a ton of meat, make it into barbecue, and feed hundreds of people. That was his thing. So very tactile, very concrete, very flesh and blood, right? My mom's gift was working with little children, teaching them to read, teaching them Bible stories, so very concrete, very tactile. We were raised in the Episcopal Church, which is liturgical, light candles, put candles out, carry crosses, hold books, all of this wonderful first half of life stuff. Learn the rules, learn them well, show up on time, church clothes, shirts tucked in, all of that. It's all great. Great way to start. By the time I get to be 19, 20, 21, 22, I realize, again, this is all upon looking back, but what I begin to realize is that I've been given a great container. The first half of life is commonly referred to as the container building. I know how to show up on time. I know how to get a job. I know how to acolyte. I know how to, do all of these ritualistic things. And I have this intuition that there's a deeper depth to go to. But I don't have really, no harm, no foul, by the way, I don't really have anybody in my life at this point that can teach me about that. Or I'm not aware that I do if they're there. So I'm out of college at this point, I think, and I just like, there's something more. There's something more. And my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, had given me this book. She was very, very pious and churchy, and she was always mailing us books. A full 80% of them were from C.S. Lewis, which is great, and we read them all. And probably 2 out of 10 were just like what I perceived to be some kind of obscure, weird thing that would just go on the shelf. Well, one of the books she mailed to me in those days was called The Way of the Pilgrim. And The Way of the Pilgrim, I believe, is a 19th century work. You could check me out on that. And it's a mystical text. And it's the story of a Russian Christian who is a pilgrim, who wants to learn how to pray without ceasing. He heard that or read that in one of Paul's letters in the New Testament, and so he sets out on a quest to learn how to pray without ceasing. And I won't take you through it all, but the Way of the Pilgrim is the book. It's almost written like a journal, I guess. That's his journey, and he runs into all manner of different people who have all manner of different ideas. And the kind of end of this story, the pinnacle of it, is that he essentially finds a mystic teacher who teaches him about the contemplative path, is the way I would put it. And I read that when I was 22, and I didn't get it at all on one level. But on another level, it was the thing I'd been waiting for forever. Because here I had found someone who, like me, in this pilgrim, in the story, was looking for that which is underneath the surface of things. So that was the beginning of my journey with the mystics. And then you got to fast forward like 10 or 15 years. Let's see. Yeah, probably something like that. And I'm a priest at this point, and I have a sense that even still there's a deeper depth to go to. And I got introduced to... how did this go? I got introduced to 12-step spirituality, to recovery spirituality, through some work I was doing at a recovery center as a chaplain in North Georgia. And the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous were, to me, just the spirituality that took one to a deeper level. Long story short, through my engagement with that recovery work, I met a guy named Richard Rohr, who's a Franciscan priest in the Roman Catholic tradition, through whom I learned to read the mystics as a spiritual practice. And I learned to read Meister Eckhart and Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross and the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing. And I found my people. This is my tribe and the fellowship of Christians. Again, kind of, I feel like this is a little circular, but they're folks who have accessed the deeper depth in our Christian tradition. So they're followers of Jesus. So this is not New Age. There's nothing hocus pocus about this. Most of the mystics we read at Good Shepherd are 400, 500, 600 years old, so these are deeply embedded in the tradition. And they're folks who essentially give me access in my early 30s to the Perennial Tradition, which is held by mystics of all the world religions for all the ages, just about. The Perennial Tradition lays out real easily. Perennial Tradition is just several simple tenets. The Perennial Tradition is, there is a God, and this God dwells within us all. I can come to know this God who dwells within us all. And then finally, knowing this God who dwells within us all intimately is life's purpose and goal. That's the Perennial Tradition as understood and taught and experienced by the mystics. So for that to be distinctly embedded in my way, the way my people have been for generations, the Christian way, just lit me up, because what I realized is I don't have to go anywhere. This is right here in our tradition. And oh, by the way, this God whom we understand to dwell within all of us is love. So it's totally congruent with what my father was teaching me at somewhat different level since I was a little boy.
Is that a way to get a sense of the tangibility of God's love, actually feeling it?
Yeah.
As opposed to thinking it?
Good, good, yeah, yeah, good. So there's thinking is great. It's a gift, and I love to do it. But yes, there's in the mystical sort of groove, if you will. This is something that's below or above. You choose the sort of metaphorical language you want beyond cognition or thinking. Yeah, yeah, and you know we're at sort of if you chase the rabbit, you chase the mystical rabbit. Where you end up is my sort of current delight, um, which is there is nowhere that God is not. I mean, that's an old, I mean, Augustine said that a long, long time ago, but the entirety of the universe is God manifesting as the entirety of the universe. Now, this is a point where we have to make we have to do a little fine tuning, because as soon as someone says, here's me or someone else say, the universe is God manifesting as the universe, they say, oh, I knew I had this guy pegged. He's a pantheist. He's a pagan and a pantheist. He's more Platonic than Christian. But then we stop. We say, nope, time out. Stay with me. Stay with me. Not a pantheist. If you must label us, and I have no need for the label, by the way, you could use more helpfully the label panentheist, which is an old term that indicates that God is within all things. Pantheism would say God is all things. So a pantheist, which, by the way, sidebar, I don't know why we're so hard on pantheist. I mean, pantheism is actually, I'm not a pantheist, but it's a lovely thought. You know, but anyway, that's a bit of a rabbit. Pantheist would say the tree is God. A panentheist would say God is within the tree. You know, and here's where a mystic like Meister Eckhart helps us. And Eckhart is a 13th century Christian mystic, right? Eckhart would say, were it not for God pouring the tree into existence, there would be no tree. Now, my most traditionalist Orthodox Christian friends would agree with that. And if they didn't, I would just say respectfully, well, tell me, where did the tree come from? Well, the tree came from God. And I'd say, you and I agree. Eckhart says one of the things that gets us down the road wonderfully, Meister Eckhart says, is contemplating on our nothingness without God. Well, you're saying I'm nothing? Now I've got a self-esteem problem. No. Time out. Back up. How would you be here without God? That's your nothingness without God. God dwells within you. The mystics go further to say, Eckhart does this for us, my ground and God's ground are one. So the very ground that is the source of God, who's sourcing the universe into being moment by moment in real time, is the same stream of divine being that is pouring us into existence right this second. My teacher, Jim Finley, a contemporary mystic, says, Hendree, were God to choose to stop pouring you into existence in this moment, you would disappear from our view. You would not be. So, once I see that, I can't unsee it. There's no going back for me from that. And it's a great relief. You know, to think that God had this idea for creation nearly 14 billion years ago, and sort of concocted on his potter's wheel this technique for creation called evolution. And then the universe burst into being with a big bang. And in the earliest milliseconds of it, let's say earliest moments of it, the whole universe was a hot, dense mess of hydrogen, helium, and a little bit of lithium. And then 13.8 billion years later, to the second, all that hydrogen has evolved and led to this moment where we're now the cutting edge of evolution, talking about what it is and feels like to be God's evolutionary creatures. So the mystics are just very comfortable in that conversation. There's an enormous amount of mystery and wonder and joy. And one of the reasons I'm so attracted to this branch of our Christian tradition is that it takes all the darn pressure off. We are all little, insignificant, and utterly significant, don't resolve the tension, parts of this big, marvelous project. God's dream for us, as Teilhard de Chardin puts it, another mystic who died, there's a contemporary of Einstein's, a priest and a scientist. He says God's great dream is that we might all be born ever onwards in the universal becoming. Now, if that doesn't make you smile, I'm not sure you can smile. There's just so much joy in being a part of that. It also means that I don't have to carry the weight of the world around my shoulders. God's got this thing. So then my job, it almost kind of discharges and recharges me at the same time. Because my job now is not to carry the weight of the world or the universe around on my shoulders, but it's to be an active participant in this thing. I want to be God's good guy, or if I was a girl, God's good girl, and grow. Like, water me, Lord Jesus. How can I grow here? And not so I can get into heaven when I die or anything like that, but that'll be fine, and we'll all go there, and won't it be neat? But so I can be a part of the active grace and growth of this whole project. So, yeah, Michael, I wouldn't ask me about the mystics, and I'll never stop talking.
I get that.
Yeah. It's important. It's important, and I think that's that's what one of the things. This is wild. Carolyn would believe this kind of thing, but I didn't know in a real sort of technical sense. Like, I didn't have any data or proof that Good Shepherd would be a good place for us to do what we're doing right now and have been for 6 years. Contemplative church, deep dive into the mystics, but I had a sense that it might. So that was, I think, my call to Good Shepherd was about, like, God saying, let's make this wager together. I think, Hendree, what's happening here is that you're being called to a deeper depth, and so are these people, and y'all might go together. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Now, apart from your passion for the mystics, has there been instances in your life of faith that were particularly meaningful or really shaped your outlook on your ministry?
I could think of a couple of things that are noteworthy. Two kind of go together. So going back to my childhood, I don't know if this was a cause of my shyness or a result of it. But I can remember being a little boy, like a young child, and having no real sense, other than being afraid about it, of where I fit. Where do I fit in this crowd of people? At school, at home, church, anywhere. And then by extension, kind of this existential thought of, like, where do any of us fit? We're all these puzzle pieces. How do we go together? And do we go together? So the question kind of grows, and for a little boy, even more scary. Not how do we fit or how do I fit, but do I fit? And then kind of dancing with the question of maybe I don't. I remember being I can't tell you exactly what age I was, but it was somewhere between kindergarten and third grade, so a little boy, and being in class at my elementary school. And having, again, kind of like that moment in the car when it became clear to me that I was to be a priest, having just this little slice, just sliced out of time where everything stopped all around me. And I dropped through to the backside of the quilt, and I had a sense that everybody belonged. All the little students and teachers and people in my school that day, everybody belonged, and we were all loved in the exact same way by God. And then moment ends, and pick back up with the reading lesson or whatever it was. And that was a helpful little foundation block in my faith life. Fast forward to my 10th grade year, so as many as 8 or 10 years later, and I was walking down the hall in my high school in a great sea of teenagers now, wondering the same thing. Where do any of us fit? Do I fit at all? And I remember I was going from class to class, so there's just a blue million teenagers in the hallway. It's loud, as you can imagine, and sort of chaotic. not unsafe, but just really busy. And I remember picking up my foot to take another step, and everything stops again. It's happened 3 times in my life. And realizing that these are all my siblings. And that we're all, I didn't have the language that I have now then, but the feeling was that we're all infinitely loved, broken people. That we're all loved by God as if we were the only available thing for God to love, and all of us loved by some strange grace in the same way. Those 2 things are enormously formative for me as I'm growing up and develop my own sense of God and community and theology and what it means to be a follower of Jesus. When I grow up and I'm able to undertake a study of the Gospels in a real rigorous, informed, and serious way, I then see, well, heck, that's Jesus' whole message, is that everybody is loved by God as if they were the only available object for God's love, and all of us love the same. So I see a real congruence with my own experience in these sort of kind of mystical experiences and the teachings of the gospel. The third little answer to your, or sort of scene from my life to answer your question, is that when I got my first job as a rector, I was serving a church in a rural situation in East Tennessee. I was about 31, 32 years old. And where we were in East Tennessee, where our church was, it was ground zero for methamphetamines in the early 2000s. Around 2006, 7, this sort of thing, 8. And we had experience of lots and lots of homeless people in our little town in this rural county in which I lived in East Tennessee. And long story short, we decided we had to do something about it as Christians. And so we started a little homeless shelter for men who were homeless for reasons related to drug and alcohol addiction. And it's called the Grace House, and it's still operating today. And we bit off way more than we could chew. I mean, I was this idealistic, I'm still an idealistic guy. I was this idealistic, far less experienced guy than I am now, young and excited and ready to take on the world, and still am those things in a lot of ways. But so we started this project that was kind of funny in a sort of a way. It was kind of doomed to fail from the start, and we did fail several times in the early days. And I used to be afraid of failure. My ego was wrapped up in it. My, insecurities were all wrapped up in failure. But God taught me through the men and women. In the early days, we had women too. That's one of the reasons we failed. Don't do a multi-gender shelter of any kind ever. That's too broad a stroke, but you get my point.
Yeah.
We failed over and over again in the early days. And what God was teaching me through that is that failure is no impediment. In fact, failure is your great teacher. My teacher, Richard Rohr, this Franciscan priest that I've talked about earlier, actually says after 30, success has very little to teach you. Failure is the thing you actually want to encounter, because it will be, again, your great teacher. So I would say that's kind of, and there are countless others, but those are kind of 3 episodes from my life that were formative, that kind of maybe speaks into your question a bit, that have put me in the place that I am now, which is a firm conviction that God is love and we are all infinitely loved, broken people. And that attachment to outcome, especially attachment to winning, success, being great, is the last thing that I want to be involved with, or that I find to be spiritually productive, or probably productive in any way.
Would it be fair to say that it's just important to show up?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's well put. I frequently think that the main ministry of the church is to be present. We're folks who show up there every day, and we're there. And some days we'll have just the right thing for you, and some days we will let you down and be insanely inadequate to your needs. And a lot of days will be somewhere in between the two, right? Most days.
Yeah.
But the thing will always be is there. will show up, will be present. And I think that's the primary vocation of a follower of Jesus Christ, is to show up. Yeah.
Well put. So I think we're almost done.
Yep.
But I wanted to ask, excuse me, I wanted to ask a last question. If there is one piece of advice or lesson that you've learned that you can pass on to people who are either in the congregation or thinking about becoming involved, what would that be?
I would say these days, what's most important to me these days is to stay curious. You know, I wonder how the world would change if all of us woke up every morning and offered a simple prayer, asking God to help us be less quick to criticism and complaint and swift to curiosity. God, slow down the part of me that sees the lack and the gap and is driven to complain about the state of whatever. Slow that part of me down. If you could stop it, God, that'd be great. But at least slow it down. And enliven and invigorate the gifts of curiosity and wonder. Help me to ask questions of people with whom I find difference, disagreement, and opposition. Help me to ask questions that are so honest and sincere that I can't help but get to know the person to whom I'm asking the question in a better, deeper, richer way through it. And I think we're all on safe ground to pray that prayer. Make me more curious, less critical, because of my firm, unwavering conviction that we're all infinitely loved by God, who is infinite love. And my further conviction, just out of experience of almost 50 years living with other human beings, that my neighbor is not thinking about me. In other words, let me put that differently. I run around in my head sometimes, maybe y'all are all fully cured of this, but I run around in my head sometimes thinking, oh, they're thinking this, that, or the other negative thought about me. Well, here's the scandal. They ain't thinking about you at all. So you don't have to waste time. We don't have to waste time assuming things, much less bad things about each other. We're all just as scared and insecure as you are, and uncertain and worried. So we can just love. I think the big pill for any of it, pill, is that the right metaphor? Anyway, I think the big pill for us to swallow, hill for us to climb, we'll mix them all up.
Yeah.
Is that, especially these days, is this what I perceive to be a theological truth? I think it's indisputable, to be honest. I could be wrong. But God loves us all the same, includes all of us. Even the people whom are acting very, very poorly are still infinitely loved, broken people. If I get pushback in my ministry, that's most common, and I'm very fortunate. I serve with a bunch of angels all the time, so I don't get a lot of complaints and pushback. Hear me on that. But people will sometimes say, are you sure it's all about love? Are you sure God loves Vladimir? Are you sure God loves fill in the blank? And I am. My mom one time said to me, she said, she's a very faithful woman. She said, even if we're wrong about all of this, Jesus, love, the whole bit, even if we're dead wrong about it, I'm at peace with it because it's the best way to live.
Thank you. And thank you for being with us today, Hendree. This is great.
Pleasure to be here.